Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I feel incredibly honored and privileged to get the chance to spend some time with you. My stepson serves in the 82nd Airborne, so we are a military family, and truly thank you all for your service. So I'm deeply honored to be here. That said, I do recognize that we come from reasonably different planets, you and I, and not least of which I have never served in the military. But I'm also not American, in case the accent hasn't given me away. I hail from Ireland, and I hail from a little fishing village on the east coast of Ireland called Termonfeckin. I promise I'm not swearing at you. That is a legitimate little place. So it's been quite a journey, to say the least, to go from a little village called Termonfeckin to the United States. When I came over here, it was about 21 years ago for graduate school in Pittsburgh. That was in the time right after I came in 2000. So that was obviously in the era post 9/11. So kind of getting visa extensions weren't really happening in that 2003 timeframe. So when I was finished with my student visa, I wasn't quite ready to go back home to Termonfeckin. So I decided I would just go north. So I packed everything I owned. This is the bit that's not in the bio, right? So I packed everything I owned in the back of a U-Haul truck and sort of drove across the border to Canada. I'd never set foot in Canada until the night I emigrated there. I had a postdoctoral fellowship, thankfully, from the Sloan Foundation, the first year of which I had spent at Carnegie Mellon, and we had some great collaborators at the University of Toronto. And we approached them and said, look, Anita has her own fellowship, she'll bring her own funding. Would you guys be able to give her a desk for a year or so, because she hasn't finished her research, she's not quite ready to go home. And they were like, let me get this straight. She's a woman with a PhD in physics who speaks English or French and brings her own money. Yes, we can find space for her at the University of Toronto without too much question. So visas were a lot easier to get for Canada with that kind of a profile. But, you know, people ask me in the course of my career, you know, what has defined my career and have I taken risks? And, you know, sometimes in real life or real time, you don't think of that necessarily as a risk. But I look back on it now, I'll be 45 in a couple of months' time, and I look back on the audacity of a 27-year-old single gal packing everything she owned in the back of a U-Haul and driving across the border into a different country that she'd never set foot in. And other than a long lost cousin of my mother's, that was the only contact I had in Canada. And I subsequently spent the next 7 or 8 years of my life there. Now, I know for all of you, crossing borders into unknown territory and not knowing anybody on the other side might be a normal day at the office. But for me, that was a little bit of certainly a memorable juncture. So to kind of put it all mildly, that in many respects was one of the first elements of sort of what became a defining characteristic of my career, which was pivoting. And I'm a great believer that you somewhat grow where you are planted. And therefore, I personally have liked the idea of repotting myself every kind of 7 to 10 years into a different industry, into a different country, into a different domain, as a way of sort of further expanding my own horizons, pushing myself out of my comfort zone, learning something new, building my network in a very interesting way. But what I have learned in the course of doing that and making these various transitions is that I do recognize that every domain and every sphere has its own vernacular, has its own modus operandi, has its own cultures, has its own norms and practices. So that's when I say that we occupy very different planets. Of all the planets I have visited, yours is not one I know really anything about. And therefore, I respect the fact that even your vernacular is quite, I think, as you all would recognize, quite developed and pronounced in the military. So I'll use words to describe phenomena in business that you may be thinking about the same phenomenon, but have very different words to describe it. So I just hope you'll work with me on the translation exercise here in our own minds. And I'll do my best, certainly, to answer your questions. So maybe just to step back a little bit and give you sort of the more recent update on my career. So after I made that transition to Canada and I worked in academia for a year or so up there, I was at an Irish networking event. So I will always say that there's a sort of Irish thread throughout my entire story. I met this lady from Dublin who was running a big part of one of the Canadian banks. And she said, you know, kiddo, have you ever thought of a career outside of academia? And I said, well, funnily enough, like my fellowship finishes next summer and I am giving some thought to what comes next. And she said, well, you should come in and talk to us at the bank. And a long story made short, I ended up going to work in her organization. And that was the beginning of a 10-year stint in financial services. And I ended up mostly on the IT, on the tech and ops side of banking. And then that was sort of before, during, and after the big financial crisis in '08. So I like to say it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But what I certainly recognized in that period after '08, so 2009, 10, 11, 12, I had a brother who was out working in Silicon Valley for Salesforce, and he was having the time of his life. And it was all this cool stuff called mobile, cloud, social, big data, what we now refer to as AI and machine learning. All of this was kind of emerging and it looked to be really hot and happening. Inside a Swiss bank in this post 2008 era where we had a lot of regulatory changes as a result of the crisis, and every discretionary dollar we had to spend had to go on meeting those regulations and those risk management requirements. So discretionary dollars for doing fun things like mobile, like mobile technology, heaven forbid we'd ever need to do that, but mobile or getting the bank into social media or anything, there just wasn't funding for that. And I was sort of this living epitome of a physics expression I like to use of like, what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. So that was what me inside a Swiss bank felt like every single day. It wasn't a good match. And everything that made me me was somewhat of a liability to a lot of the senior folks inside a conservative Swiss bank. So I decided to pivot again. So I now pivoted from starting out as a physicist, undergraduate in physics and applied math, Ph.D. in atomic and molecular physics. I decided being a physicist wasn't for me because, frankly, a personality is not a prerequisite to be an atomic physicist. If any of you hang out with atomic physicists at night. So neither is washing, by the way, on a regular basis. That also didn't seem to be high on their agenda. So I was like, okay, not for me, but I was really interested in the impact of science and technology in the world. And that's what took me over to the United States originally on a Fulbright scholarship, was to do a master's in public policy, because I figured the world was going to need people who came from science and tech backgrounds and people who also cared about public policy and the intersection where those two things meet. So again, remember, this was the year 2000. It's now, what, 2021. So I was probably about 20 years early in my prediction and my vision. But certainly now, if I roll the clock forward and I look at the issues that I am dealing with as a board director in other spheres of my life, we are starting to see a lot of these areas of intersection between science, technology, public policy, and so forth. So let's pick a couple, for example, AI and machine learning, right? We have an issue in AI and machine learning whereby only 20 to 24% of the global workforce in AI is women. And therefore, without any disrespect, no malintent, not an ounce of harm intended on the part of men, but if AI systems are built by men, we will just inherently embed the unconscious bias of those individuals into these systems. So one of the reasons why I am very, very vocal about the need for greater diversity and inclusion and representation in the tech industry is because I think we run the risk of amplifying the opinions and biases of some in these platforms and completely silencing or amplifying the absence of others because they're simply not there around the table having these strategy conversations, thinking about how these platforms will be developed, and actually doing the audiences. I say, listen, we need to be clear that if we go on this trajectory, we are putting humanity on a plane that's flying on only one wing. And we need to be clear that if we don't step up to the plate here and do everything we can to include more people in the industry, open the aperture, improve diversity and inclusion, well then we are simply, our silence, our absence is going to be coded into the future at an industrial scale we've never seen before. So that's just an example of an area where tech is meeting public policy in a very meaningful way. I think you could take the other area, which I also spent a lot of time on a couple of years back, social media, disinformation, you know, the Facebooks, Googles of the world, and the impact that that is having on democracy in this country and around the world, of course. So these are industries, these are monopolies that are in an unregulated space, quite frankly, right? As I like to remind people, you know, the Russians didn't hack Facebook. They used it as a customer, exactly the way it was architected to be used. So the sort of era of disinformation that we are now living in is having such a ripple effect, prolific effect on so many facets of our domestic and our international life, and indeed security and our democracy, that these are real issues. And this is an industry that, in my humble opinion, requires regulation. But unfortunately, we don't have that many people in Washington that are totally up to speed on the inner workings of these tech monopolies. So anyway, I just digress slightly, but they're just examples of where, as I like to remind my students, sort of doing a diverse set of things in your career and bringing a perspective from one world into another, I think is an increasingly valuable set of skills to have. I've always enjoyed people who are formerly in the military, have come to work in the corporate world, and I know there's a transition that happens there, but I think they bring tremendous value, and vice versa. And I recall, you know, one of the reasons I believe this is I recall a meeting I was in several years ago when Steve Ballmer was the CEO of Microsoft. So that's the CEO before the current guy, Satya Nadella. And at the time when we were at this meeting, it was with a bunch of chief information officers, of which I was one. Steve Jobs was still alive at the time. So, and the iPad had just come out. Some of you might be too young to remember when that happened. The iPad had just come out, and Ballmer asked us, how many of you have iPads? And so again, the iPad was only had 1 or 2 weeks, and probably 2/3 of us in the room had an iPad. So Ballmer kind of, you know, he wasn't entirely pleased. But he did say, look, he said, I'll give Jobs one thing. The iPad is an innovative piece of hardware, and the iPad is an innovative piece of software. And he said, among Steve's many geniuses, he is incredibly good at unlocking the value on the hardware software seam. And that phrase stuck in my mind ever since then, and has applied to my own thinking about my own career, because I do believe that people who can unlock value on the seam between two industries, two disciplines, two functions, two experiences, those people are incredibly valuable. They are literally people who can speak multiple languages, and I mean that sort of metaphorically speaking. So I used to worry, frankly, that I was a bit of a jack of all trades. You know, I'd done a little bit of this, a little bit of physics, and a little bit of public policy, and a bit of academia, and then my decade in banking. And then 7 years, I made this pivot into the tech industry. And I used to worry that I looked like I wasn't committed to anything. And it wasn't necessarily that. I was still figuring out kind of where my passions ultimately lay. But what I did discover along the way is that having an innate level of curiosity about your own world and the world around you is an incredibly valuable skill. I believe that curiosity is it's a skill. It's not a trait. It's not a characteristic. It's a state, right? It's a process that you build. It's a skill that you develop. But having that allows you to kind of accumulate a set of experiences that may not architecturally look like they make sense, but when you thread them together, add up to an interesting, unique value proposition. So, so just to bring you up to present context, and I don't know if I'm entirely on the money here, what you're hoping to learn about me or from me, but I'll get into some more substantive business issues that I apply this kind of background to. But if I roll the clock forward to the present day, like I mentioned, 7 years ago, so this is a 2013 timeframe, post the financial crisis, I was really tired of being inside a Swiss bank, and I really wanted to jump on this tech bandwagon, because I figured, you know, as that Wayne Gretzky expression of skating to where the puck is going. See, I did spend 7 years in Canada. I know a thing or two about that. I also learned that you're not ever going to have a conversation with a Canadian man that lasts for longer than 2 minutes if you don't understand ice hockey. So I had to learn some things. That was back in the days when I was single. So anyhow, so skating to where the puck was going, I decided to jump into the tech industry 7 years ago. And that happened to coincide with a period in my life when I met the man who's now my husband. And Joe will know a little bit of this story, but I married a widower who came with the distinct, interesting background of having 5 children. So I married a widower with 5 children, and then we had a honeymoon baby. Now, why is this relevant? Because I went from my little life as a single gal with my little apartment in Manhattan and my little career that I was now migrating over to Silicon Valley And the next thing I knew, I was a wife, I was a mother, I was a stepmother, and there's a lot of humans in my immediate orbit. And that changed things for me. Now, I'm Irish, my husband is Irish American, so not surprisingly, I literally have redheaded stepchildren. I literally have two. One of them lives with me, and I have a redheaded stepson-in-law. I mean, you couldn't make it up. So why am I sharing this? Because 7 years ago, when I was at this most recent pivot point in my career into the tech industry, this sort of dramatic kind of different arc of personal change came my way. And I had to have a very honest conversation with myself about what I was solving for in that chapter of my life. And I really believe that when you think about your career, you pick the one or two things that are most important to you at a given juncture, a chapter, but it's a logarithmic scale. It's not linear. Number 3 is down here on the right-hand side. And I decided 7 years ago that I needed to solve for flexibility in my schedule so I could be in New York or be on the West Coast, because John is a New Yorker and I wanted to work out there. And I also needed to have, I wanted time. I wanted time to be a mom and to be a stepmom and to be a wife. And that meant that I had to forgo things like not becoming a CEO. So I was interviewing for CEO jobs of, these unicorn tech companies, and I didn't get to do that. I had to forgo a lot of compensation, right? There's a lot of things that you forgo, but as long as you are intellectually and emotionally honest with yourself about what you are really solving for in your life, well, then what you're doing, it doesn't, nothing else matters, because you are so committed, and that sort of fulfills your entire purpose and your set of values, that whatever you might be sacrificing or forgoing is irrelevant, quite frankly. So that became sort of a decision point for me. And then over the last 7 years, what I've done is I've built out what I'm referring to as a portfolio career. Now, I used to get very offended when people would ask me when I was ever going to work full time. Like, whoa, hang on. There's a big difference between working full time and working on one thing full time, right? I work full time, but I just happen to work on a broad portfolio of things. So now that portfolio, and I promise I'm getting to more substantive, interesting stuff. That portfolio comprises of serving on the boards of directors of 6 companies, 3 public, 3 private. I am also a visiting professor at Princeton University this year, where I'm teaching a class on female entrepreneurship. And when I'm not doing all of that, I do quite a lot of speaking, a little bit of writing, dabbling here and there in sort of 2 areas. One is this area of diversity, inclusion, and belonging, which I feel very strongly about. And then the other thing I do is that a couple of years back, I started to post what I call my wisdom cards on social media. And where they came from was, over all of these years, as I moved from Ireland to the United States and so forth, I used to keep journals and diaries. I'm a big fan of having mentors and sponsors, and I was just a sponge for advice and wisdom and insight and mentorship along the way, which I generally captured. And I kept them on these little kind of 2x3 cards. And I now have 5,000 of them. So I have sort of 5,000 gems of wisdom from the people that I've met along the way. Many of whom, quite frankly, because I got more disciplined about it in the last 5 years or so, many of them reflect what I've learned in boardrooms. Because when I joined my first board at the age of 37, which is quite young to join boards, most people do it when they're retired. So they're a lot older and more experienced, frankly. I must tell you a really good story about when I went to interview with General Hugh Shelton. That was a nerve-wracking one. But nevertheless, so there's me and General Hugh Shelton talking about being on a board together, just to give you some sense of the dichotomy there. But nevertheless, I'm sitting in these rooms and I'm saying, wow, I'm sitting here beside the guy who's now the CEO of Nike, John Donahoe. I served on his board when he was the CEO of ServiceNow for several years. I'm sitting here with Dan Schulman, who's the CEO of PayPal. He was my chair at Symantec for 6 years. I'm sitting here with Jerry Laybourne, who was the CEO of Nickelodeon and then founded Oxygen Media with Oprah back in the day. These kinds of people. And I was like, I need to capture what they say and how they think and how they deal with a crisis, or how they think about strategy, or how they think about HR issues, because there's just so much wisdom here. So I started to do that. And then I post these cards kind of every week or so, because my original intent was, I'm going to take all of this wisdom and I'll write a book, and it'll be a New York Times bestseller and it'll be fantastic. And as you all know from my life story so far, life has an unbelievable way of interfering with my plans. So said book never happened, or hasn't happened as of yet. And I said, it's a shame to leave all of this wisdom sitting here in the corner of my office. I'll just start sharing it and start posting. So my portfolio involves my board work, my work at Princeton, my work kind of as a speaker, and sort of the wisdom cards as an appendage of that. So I'll pause there because I'm going to move now, if it's okay, into talking about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and how I think about that from a business standpoint. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to field them on the kind of career journey so far.
Yeah, I'll throw out a question, ma'am. And it's funny you bring up the Steve Ballmer story. There's another Steve Ballmer story you may be familiar with. He's being interviewed by MSNBC TV, financial network, and the question that was posed to Steve Ballmer is about Steve Jobs' launch of the iPhone. And it was I think, in the context of the interview, it was the iPhone had just been launched. Steve Jobs is talking about it for the first time. He's swiping across the screens. And the interviewer asked Steve Ballmer, well, what do you think about this new technology? And how does Microsoft respond to that? And Steve Ballmer's I can't get his exact words, but effectively he said, Steve Jobs hasn't sold a single iPhone yet.
I remember that.
There's not a single iPhone in the hands of anyone. Like, he hasn't figured out how to market this thing. He hasn't figured out how to get this thing global. We've got the software. Our software is in every phone. Motorola is king. He's got a long ways to go.
Yeah.
And so I see that, and that reminds me on so many occasions of some of the fights that we as leaders, even in the military, have, where we have these emerging technologies, and we're explaining to leaders, business or otherwise, military normally, that we have this idea and we think it's going to work. Some of these guys in this room have been in those situations, and they're getting struck down by the titans of whatever the communities are, whether it's engineers or logistics or the warfighting organizations that we exist in. And I'm sure, as someone from your background, coming from a small fishing village in Ireland, this is not a fight that you're unfamiliar with. And I guess my question, that's a long way of asking, what is your technique or what experiences have you learned, or what processes do you use? I know you're familiar with a scientific method, or you're solving for a particular problem. What's your experience when it comes to presenting a new idea that you think is relevant, worthwhile, of entertainment, and how do you get this thing across the line?
Yeah, great question. So we're now sort of into the realm of change management in some respects, and change leadership. And this was basically these were the kinds of jobs that I occupied inside financial services. So for 10 years, I gave a great deal of thought to exactly this question. How do you affect change particularly inside large organizations with a lot of inertia? And I can't say that I ever found the silver bullet, but I'll share some of sort of what I used to call my mantras. The first thing I used to remind people is that innovation is a mindset as much as anything else. And sort of creating that mindset among people is a part of the job, right? So it's not that, Anita, you're the chief innovation officer and this is your job. I used to remind people that as a chief innovation officer, my job was simply to facilitate this across the broader organization, but innovation is everybody's job. The second thing, I used to be very clear as well about what innovation was and what innovation wasn't. And while a lot of us immediately think about emerging tech as sort of innovation, and surely it is, and certainly in the business world, we would think about new products, right? We've got to create new stuff, right? That's another form of innovation. But Michael Dell has this great quote where he says, new technology will win you fans, technology innovation will win you fans, but process innovation will make you a lot of money. So if you think about the story behind Dell's story was a process, right? He changed the way in which computers were assembled and distributed and sold directly to customers. So a huge element of what I always used to focus on was how can we improve the processes around here and how can we make them more efficient? And that was normally something you could win hearts and minds on a little easier. And typically there was a technology solution to do that. But I went about it kind of in an indirect way, if that makes sense. The third thing I used to tell people is that most resistance comes from noble places, right? There's a reason why we resist change, and that's generally speaking it's a form of protectionism, right? So where somebody sort of often kind of where you stand on something depends on where you sit, right? So I used to spend a lot of time understanding what's the seat that this person occupies and why might they be resistant to my suggestion? Why might they be resistant to my change? And a lot of the times, what I would hear from the business leaders is, look, we don't have capacity. Anita, this mobile banking, this sounds great. I'm sure it'll be big someday, but not this year. Our plate is full. So one of the things that I carved out with my partners in the financial world and financial services was your team we'll talk about time horizons, right? So let's talk about not to 18 months, which is entirely your jurisdiction. I won't spend any time worried about what you're doing today. 18 to 3 years is a space where we will work on things together that we know are coming, right? Like, AI is going to be a big part of your future operations in every respect. You know that VR is, virtual reality is going to be, or augmented reality, going to be part of the universe going forward. So let's work on things that we know are on our horizon and we can work on them together. So that's small pilots, proofs of concepts, things like that. And then for stuff that's 3 years and out, leave that to my team, leave that to the innovation team, because you guys definitely don't have bandwidth to deal with that. So that was one of the ways in which we kind of divvied it up a little bit, was to say, I'll really worry exclusively about 3 years. You really worry about not to 18 months, and we'll share 18 months to 3 years as a time frame and work on things together. And that just made sort of people a little clear on roles and responsibilities, and was a way of kind of not having people feel that, oh, here comes the innovation guys with all their big smart ideas, but they don't have to deal with my reality of running this place every day, or fixing what's not broken, or whatever it might be, the various forms of resistance. And then the other learning I had along the way, um, which is sort of, it's a thing that Bezos does. So Bezos has this thing where he separates the inputs to something from the outputs. So what do I mean by that? So Bezos sort of, if a team is working on something and it doesn't work, just because the outcome wasn't successful doesn't mean that the inputs and the process along the way wasn't very valuable, right? So this is almost like your AARs kind of thing, right? It's reflecting back on what just happened and what went well and what didn't go well. And the reason I bring that up in the context of innovation was we were very quick. Once we looked at an emerging technology, or once one of my colleagues would look at something, if they didn't think it was going to work, or they didn't think it was relevant, they would dismiss it, done, dead. And if I brought it back again a year later or whatever, they go, we looked at that, Anita. We looked at this mobile banking stuff a year ago. We decided it wasn't for us. But what I only realized in retrospect is that I had a model of this funnel idea, right? Where we'd start with like 100 ideas, and 3 of them might make it out to market. I had a batting average of about 2 to 4% or so of every 100 ideas, 2 to 4 made it all the way through. But when I look back, the funnel wasn't the right model. It should have been a conveyor belt, because a good idea works when it hits the combination of 3 perfect things. First of all, the technology has to be at the right stage to be usable. So something that's too emerging, that isn't going to be robust enough, mature enough, scalable enough, or secure enough for your environment is going to get shot down really fast. So there's sort of a point in the life cycle of a technology when it is just simply more readily adoptable because it's robust enough, it's hardened enough. So that's the first thing. The second thing, there had to be a clearly defined need. Now, in my world, we would call it a customer need, right? Like, but in your world, you might have it, you might call it an operational need or security need or something. But there needed to be a pronounced need for something, right? And then the third thing is, again, I'll try and do my best to translate. But in my world, I used to say, we also need to be able to make a buck or save a buck here, right? Now, So those three things had to come together perfectly. The tech had to be robust enough, scalable enough, mature enough, secure enough. The need had to be pronounced enough for enough people, right? And I'm going to give you an example. And thirdly, there needed to be a business case, like either make a buck or save a buck. In your world, if I were to translate a little bit, let me take you back to mobile banking. So when I started to get the bank I was working for in Canada to look at mobile banking back in 06, 07, this pre-iPhone, the only technology that was really available to us was SMS texting, right? So you could text money. So there wasn't Venmo or any of these apps or whatever. Secondly, it was clear to us in the Canadian market that the only people who were really interested in doing payments on their mobile phones were young people and immigrants to Canada. Immigrants who came from countries where mobile phone technology was more widely adopted. So it wasn't a mass scale need in the Canadian market back in 06, 07. And the third thing was we couldn't figure out a business model with the telcos. So if you think about AT&T or Verizon, the equivalent up there is Rogers and Bell. And Rogers were very clear, if these are mobile phone customers, they're our customers, right? This is our customer experience, our share of wallet. But we were, RBC, the Royal Bank of Canada, we're like, no, if this is a banking service, then they're our customers. So we actually couldn't figure out at that time a business model that worked for all parties. Now, if I translate that into your world, what might that look like? Well, the technology being scalable enough, robust enough, I think that's a fairly no-brainer. The customer need, I think, makes sort of being a pronounced enough need for enough people, right? So that enough people can see if we went down this path, there could be value. But the third area where I'm talking about a make a buck or save a buck, I think it's always very helpful to know what you are displacing in an ecosystem. And let me give you, in my world of enterprise technology, generally as a CIO, I had a finite budget to spend on tech. So if a new vendor comes in with a new technology that looks very cool, I'm not going to get an incremental $10 million to do this next year. I'm going to have to cut 10 million from somewhere else in order to fund this project. So the vendors that were most effective in selling to me were those that came in and said, our system replaces the dollars that you are spending on X, Y, and Z. And therefore, if you cut those out, if you go with us, not only do we think we'll provide a better solution and give you more efficiency, more innovation, whatever you might want, but we also believe that you'll save money because you'll be displacing these dollars. So sometimes the way to navigate change can be to understand sort of this Archimedes principle of what are you displacing and what throughout the ripple, what throughout the ecosystem will that affect and who will it affect and why might they defend the status quo? So is that helpful? I'm doing my best to translate into your universe, but I know it's not directly analogous.
No, it's that's definitely on the mark, and this is the kind of non-military examples that I'm in search for, because the last thing is, the military does a very good job at being its own echo chamber.
Right.
We all speak the same language. We all generally think the same, and we promote those who do that really exceptionally well. And what gets harder is in our little micro communities where maybe you can relate and you come across these small organizations, and we have them. We have, in this very room, we have chief officers who live and die in these kind of organizations. They spend their entire career and they've devoted themselves to becoming an officer in the specific MLS. And then you have titans at the top of that MLS, at the top of that community, who kind of have unusual amount of sway on who gets selected and promoted and who goes to what great duty station. And so there's almost like a benevolence that you got to have to survive in this community. And it stifles in some ways innovation. And so if you're going to pitch a good idea, if you're going to pitch an idea in that community or any community, you almost risk everything by doing so. And the reality in many ways is that the enemy could care less. Like the next fight we are going to fight, the enemy that we're going to be facing could care less about what our communities say, could care less about who got what duty station. None of that matters, because in the next fight, people are going to live and die based on the decisions we make now and the innovations we make now. And that's the bat that matters. That's when you swing that thing, when regardless of what you hit along the way, that is kind of the thing that matters. We got to win the next war.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to get your perspective on how I wrote these down, to basically deliver that pitch to our leaders with our ideas and to make sure it at least touches one of those things.
Yeah.
Because
and the timing, right? The timing is sort of, I guess, the meta message there about your timing might be off on one occasion, but could be right on another occasion. So it's always interesting to think, is this the moment? But you also bring up a couple of other interesting things that sort of dovetail into the realm of leadership when it comes to innovation and change. Actually, my wisdom card that I posted last week was the following. It was, because I listen without judgment, people speak without fear. And it was a quote that came from Bill McDermott, who's the CEO of ServiceNow, one of the boards I serve on. And prior to this, Bill was the CEO of SAP, so very, very large, based in Germany, very large enterprise tech company. But there's an interesting thing there about the roles that leaders play in stifling innovation. And one of this is this issue of whether you are willing to listen in such a way to crazy, little wacky, maybe out of left field ideas, and create a culture where people feel that they can genuinely put those ideas on the table without fear of judgment, criticism, or even what you're referring to as sort of reprimand, in terms of, this may cost me sort of the ability to ascend here, right? Am I going to risk my career? So when you have a culture where people are doing those calculations in their heads, you are by default stifling creativity and innovation, even if you do not recognize it. Because as long as people are acting in their own self-interest, which is ostensibly what that is, I will not speak up because I do not want to lose my career or this opportunity of promotion. And that's more important than me throwing out an idea that might just save lives or might just help us defeat the enemy the next time we're out there up against them, right? This is where culture kind of really matters. And I know that you guys spend a lot of time thinking about culture, so I'm not going to attempt to illuminate, any of your thinking. But what I will say when it comes to innovation, I remind leaders that, number one, you're going to get a culture anyway. The only question is whether or not you actively shape it. Now, you shape your culture as a military. That's part of what defines your success. But there are kind of, just as there are microclimates in the Bay Area, there are microclimates and there are microcultures inside organizations as well. So the question then becomes, what are you doing to not necessarily create a microculture of innovation, but what are you doing to impede it? What are you doing to constrain it? What are you doing to sort of obstruct it? And one of the things that you can do to obstruct it without knowing is have leaders who sort of don't display that humility or that innate curiosity themselves, that says to people, I give you permission to throw your crazy ideas on the table here, right? So this brings me now into a really important topic that's near and dear to my heart, is this idea of belonging, which is kind of, to me, the holy grail of where cultures need to go. And let me just preface what I'm going to say. I'm not here to talk about diversity and inclusion. I know the military has its own whole stance on all of that, policy-wise and every other way. But the reason I talk about diversity and inclusion and belonging, what I refer to as DIBS, as a board director, is that my job as a board director is to protect the long-term interests of shareholders. And I believe that unless you have a diverse range of perspectives around the table, and unless you have a culture where people genuinely feel they belong, not just where they're included, but where they genuinely feel that they belong, and ergo, you actually get to harness those diverse perspectives, well then, if you don't have that, it's basically kryptonite. It's kryptonite when it comes to innovation and transformation and change and ergo competitiveness. So what I sort of say, if I just talk about diversity on boards, one of my spiels is like, the average tenure of board directors in the US is 12 years. Now, if you're on a board for 12 years, at least maybe a little bit years off, a couple of years off in my narrative now, but you'll get the gist. I used to say, if you're on a board for 12 or 15 years, that means and most of these people were operators 15 years ago and then started doing board work. So you're pre-iPhone, you're pre-financial crisis, you're pre-Brexit, you're pre-Trump, you're pre the whole move on climate change, you're pre the whole move on Me Too, diversity and so forth. You're prehistoric, basically, right? You belong to an era where none of those things were issues that were on the board agenda, right? And they are on the board agenda today. Now, I haven't even mentioned AI, IoT, or cybersecurity. So in my mind, what I say to boards is that unless we put a diverse range of skills and experiences around the table that are commensurate with the dynamic nature of the 21st century threats and challenges and opportunities that we face as business leaders, if we don't do that, that's a dereliction of our duties, right? So I kind of would apply the same analogy to the leadership here, just to say, you're heading out into a whole new world order of 21st century combat and competitiveness. These are challenges. They are genuinely unprecedented. The pace of change is getting faster. We know that. And, COVID, I was trying to talk to people 2 years ago about the need for leaders to understand the nature of exponential change. And if you think about the pandemic, it's just a perfect example of that. It's the example of something you're dealing with that is exponential in its nature and its growth. And yet we look at it with lagging indicators, which are the number of people infected and the number of deaths. And that's why we got there's a million reasons why we got caught flat-footed, but that's one of the things you're up against here is change that's happening at a rapidly accelerating pace and leading indicators that are the ways in which you think about it. So I ask leaders, what are the leading indicators for some of these things in your line of work that you need to be watching? Because change, and technological change in particular, tends to sort of have this sort of hockey stick effect, right? It looks like it's emerging, then boom, the next thing you know, it's all over the place. So we were looking at kind of social media and whatever, and then boom, in the space of 4 years' time, suddenly this is at the heart of a threat to democracy, right? That felt like it happened overnight. We're going to see the same thing with augmented reality. It's going to be everywhere very soon. We're going to see the same thing with virtual reality. One of the boards I'm on specializes in kind of technological trends, and they talk about the cell phoneization of VR, right? Meaning that VR will become as ubiquitous as cell phones are now. So that is going to matter in your world, right? It will matter from a training standpoint. I'm sure maybe you're all already prolific users. We're not in the corporate world yet, but it's coming, and it's going to hockey, right? So, and the same thing with AI, and the same thing with IoT. So I personally think that we'll be living in a world where we'll have sensors everywhere. All of the data coming off that is going to be essential. And that has real implications for the types of skill sets that you are deploying and recruiting and training, because you're going to need, sort of in these digitally native worlds, you're going to need everybody to have an element of understanding at a minimum about engineering and data science and so forth, if not actual advanced expertise. So again, I know I'm probably preaching to converted here because you have all of that. The point I'm making is one, just understanding that in an era of exponential change, the half-life of our skill sets gets shorter and shorter and shorter. So you need to continually think about retraining, but also then that the qualities that you need in a leader to lead in an era of exponential change means that qualities like humility are very important, because you have to be humble enough to recognize that you don't know what you don't know. And then right after humility, you need curiosity, because you need to be then able to open your mind up to ask the right questions and then to encourage all of your subordinates to do the same thing. And I'm not necessarily sure that humility and curiosity will be at the top of what we would think about when we move people up in promotion in a military context. But again, I could be wrong. So I'll pause there because I could go off on 1,000 tangents. But I do want to just get back to belonging at some point if we can.
Yeah. I'll turn it over to the room, see if there's any questions, any thoughts.
The one thought that you brought up that I think is something that's often overlooked is the process innovation. People tend to just think innovation is solely tech related. However, there's a multitude of things that we deal with at Detachment that are working that is process innovation. And I think, just hearing it from your board is just reassuring that we're not the only ones that struggle with that also.
Right. But it is the heart of how you actually enact change in organizations. Because you think about change in organizations, everything is a process, right? Whether it's the personal way in which we get work done ourselves, or it's the organizational way in which you move things around, right? Whether that's paper or people or anything. So putting processes at the heart of how you think about innovation, I always found was a really sort of helpful place to start, and also less intimidating for people. Because most people, if you say, listen, help me map out this process and let's look for areas of inefficiency or shortfalls or whatever, most people feel like they'll have a read on that. But if you ask people, hey, let me think, let's have a chat about automation and workflow and how we might use data to make things more efficient, and be like, not my jurisdiction, not my wheelhouse, right? So process innovation lies at the heart of a lot of other innovation, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you.
The other thing I used to always say about innovation is that innovation isn't always blue sky. I mean, I'm talking about some major technology trends, fair enough, but I always like to remind people that the guy who decided to turn the ketchup bottle upside down, you know, that guy, I mean, he didn't invent a new product. He didn't sort of revolutionize the world, but he sure as hell added a lot of new value. So one of the ways in which I used to define innovation is that innovation adds new value, not necessarily new things, right? The guy who put wheels, I'm assuming it was a guy, I shouldn't perhaps say that, but the guy that put wheels on a suitcase, I'm pretty sure didn't invent the suitcase and didn't invent the wheel, but surely unlocked a lot of value. The guy or gal who put 2-in-1 shampoo together, right? Didn't invent shampoo or conditioner, but unlocked a lot of value. So often, again, we're back to this kind of unlocking value on the seam between two things. So quite often it's the recombination of things that already exist in your ecosystem that can be quite interesting as a way of unlocking new value.
I think we had a question over here.
So ma'am, I did have one question. We mentioned innovation and how it's delivered, the different methods in which we can get those hired to kind of understand. Now flipping it from a different perspective of when that innovation is actually snuffed. In the Marine Corps, we get a lot of training when it comes down to trying to find the why, or also the buy-in, which kind of correlates with your next point I believe you're going to talk about, which is the belonging. Mm-hmm. How do you find your why? You know, because when that innovation is snuffed, at that point you're somewhat discouraged. You know, you want to maintain that curiosity. You want to figure out different methods, different ways. Granted, I think you answered, if one individual has a why and another individual has a why, to bridge that gap between the two whys, you know, you listen without judgment and people speak without fear. But what happens when that innovation is snuffed? What happens when you're discouraged? How do you find your why to keep going?
Yeah, great question. So I'm going to speak more generally about belonging in a second, but let me just answer relative to innovation. So there's two things here. First of all, you manage success by or you foster success by managing expectations, right? So I used to tell my team that you know, we had a batting average of 2 to 4. So you have 100 ideas and 2 or 4 of them would make it all the way through the pipeline. But that doesn't mean that the 96 ideas were bad, and it certainly doesn't mean that the people that come up with those 96 ideas are any less valuable to the team, right? So it's sort of decoupling the input into something, including the person, versus the output, right? Like, so your value is not determined by whether or not your idea was successful. And I used to use this analogy with them. I used to say, look, guys, you know, on the flip side of that, just because you drove home drunk and didn't get in an accident doesn't mean that you made a good decision. Right? So you have to decouple the process from the outcome. Sometimes the process can be very good, but you have a disappointing outcome, or sometimes the process can be very bad, driving drunk, and you have an okay outcome, arrive home alive, right? So that was one thing, sort of decoupling those two things, where we're not just measured and valued and appreciated by virtue of the success of our outcomes, but by our contribution to the process, to the inputs, right? Like I said, that was a big Bezos thing. On the belonging front, however, when you have a culture where people genuinely feel they belong. So I'm going to give you my corporate version of this. I know you guys have your own versions, but I talk about belonging as sort of having three legs of the stool. So the first is cultural belonging, second is functional belonging, and the third is enabling belonging. So cultural belonging has sort of 2 prongs to it: acceptance and trust. So this is, yes, you are included here in the military, you're included as a Marine, and you're not included just kind of in spite of your warts, but you're included because of your warts. Like, we want you, we accept you, we value you, warts and all, right? So you are included and valued for everything that you are. That's sort of that. So when you feel that level of acceptance, and then you're sort of in an environment of trust and be trusted, right? I can trust my life with these guys, they can trust their lives with mine. Then you're going to feel like, yep, I can harness then the diverse, unique perspectives and skills that this person brings to the table. If you put a diverse team together and they don't feel acceptance and trust, or the other elements of belonging as well, you'll never get the benefit of having them there in the first place. So there's a big difference between being included in a team and actually feeling that you belong. And the analogy, so one of the ways I describe is like, if diversity is like a seed and inclusion is the crop, belonging is how you harvest them. If you don't have belonging, you don't get the benefit of having diversity and inclusion in the first place, right? It's necessary, but not sufficient. So second element of belonging is cultural belonging, is functional belonging, which I think you guys probably do very well. So that is one, you know why you belong together, right? I think you know why you belong together as a group of people, right? So you have utmost clarity of purpose. And you keep reminding people of that. And it's particularly important in times of crisis and when you're deployed and when you're under stress, because people need to know the purpose, the higher purpose that they serve. They know why they belong together as a team. And then the second thing is you have what's called a spine of beliefs. It's sort of a shared, this is what I call values in action. So again, you probably live and breathe this far better than we do. And we take lessons from elite performing teams like yours. But in the corporate world, you can say, we value diversity, we value candor, we value whatever, right? Blah, blah, blah. And you bring in consultants and you put these value statements on a wall, nice and shiny. And then you go and you reward behavior that is a counter to your values, right? So let me give you an example from the corporate world. One company I worked in hired big consultants, launched the new values, and they're going to be integrity, honesty, and something, right? And innovation maybe. And they were put in every elevator in every building, and everybody knew the new values. It was great. And then they went out and hired two guys as co-heads of the investment bank, and they were bad guys. They were known in the industry as being low integrity and dishonest and not good guys. And the rest, so many of us inside the company said, hang on a second. So you just said over here that these are our values, and then you just went over here and did this. And whenever you start to kind of make exceptions, so often in the corporate world, we make exception for rainmakers, right? Oh, we'll look the other way on that guy's little sort of inappropriate comments to the ladies, or inappropriate situation with his executive assistant. We'll look the other way because he's a rainmaker. So when you start making exceptions to your values, you start putting cracks in your foundation, in your cultural foundation. And you're on a slippery slope, right? So sort of, I love a thing that the All Blacks, the New Zealand rugby team, use, and they don't talk about values, they talk about standards, because these are big macho rugby guys, and they're like, values are wishy-washy to us. But when we say these are our standards, that means this is what we stand for. And there's no ambiguity in that, right? So that's sort of reconnecting people to the purpose is really important, particularly when they are disheartened for whatever reason. So if you think about the last year for us in business world, with COVID and everything else, we've seen a lot of people stepping back, a lot of people stepping out of their careers, women in particular. And what I just remind people is that belonging to an employee is like gravity to an astronaut. If you don't have enough of it, you're going to break off and drift away. And belonging is tested in times of crises. So people are now saying, oh, hang on a second, I was running in this race and I got tripped up by this COVID thing, no fault of my own. Some people lift their heads up and just start running the race again. And other people are lifting their heads up and going, why was I running in this race in the first place? Like, I don't appreciate, I don't miss my 2-hour commute, and I don't miss like not seeing that difficult guy down the hallway every day. And I don't, right? So people are now making elections to step out and step away, because the crisis has shown that there's a bunch of things more of a higher priority in their lives, right? So these are the ways in which belonging is tested. Now, in your world, there's a very different analogy for that, but this is this bond of belonging. This is why it matters. And then the last kind of holy grail of belonging is what's called enabling belonging. So this is where you know that this is a place and a space where you will be at your best and you will do your best. And I think that's probably core to the culture you try and create. But it's also then where you belong and make better. So meaning that I have a responsibility here, not just to belong to this organization, but to leave it in better shape than I found it. And I have a responsibility to create a culture where other people feel that sense of belonging every day. So one of the reasons I love to talk about belonging and not diversity and inclusion is because it's a word that transcends all languages and all cultures, right? I'm often speaking to audiences of white guys, and I say to them, listen, you can be a white man sitting around a table full of white men and not feel that you belong for a lot of different reasons, right? There's a lot of research that shows in organizations like yours, things like tenure, things like rank, things like seniority. These are the types of things that can actually impede a sense of belonging and cause people to be reluctant to speak up in the presence of more superior officers and so forth. So again, the culture sort of starts to create these norms and these practices. And if you don't watch that carefully, you can start to really, one, impede innovation, because people will simply say, I'm not putting my crazy idea on the table because I fear being judged or criticized. But even more than that, if you allow that to become too much of a thing, people will simply hear what management, they'll say what they think management want to hear. And then you're in really dangerous territory, because then, to your point, if I'm sitting there and I have an idea for a technology that one day might save lives, but I don't say it because I don't want to say it in the company of somebody more superior than me, then what are you doing, right? Then you're harming yourself as a means of this culture. So you see that in operating theaters, doctor makes a mistake, nurse isn't willing to point it out because they're like, this person's a superior person, right? There's great research done about, and again, you guys are probably all familiar with this, but the space shuttle Columbia disaster. Remember the ones with the O-rings and the foam strikes? Remember that disaster?
Oh, Challenger? Yeah.
Yeah. So the after action report said there was a really critical meeting where senior engineers and the management top brass were in the same meeting. Engineers suspected there was going to be an issue with the foam strikes, but they didn't say it. And the after action report looked at and said there was a culture within NASA that impeded candid communications between differing divisions and ranks and whatever. And that's where this sort of, again, being included isn't enough. The engineers were included in the room, but they did not feel that they belonged enough to be able to speak up. So inclusion is like, if I'm having a party and I say, hey guys, you're all invited to my party on Saturday night. It's going to be great. You're all so welcome. So happy you're coming. But here's the thing, Joe. It's my party. So it's my music. It's my guest list. It's my food. It's my everything. And whenever the party's over, Joe, you can be asked to leave. You don't have to go home, but you can be asked to leave. Now, Joe's included in my party. But the difference with belonging is that you get to co-create the thing to which it is that you're included in. It's not saying, Joe, here's the team. Welcome. You're very welcome. Now, Joe, you do everything you can to fit in, please. You fold yourself like a pretzel in any way that you feel you need to in order to conform with the dominant culture of the organization. So this is where giving people a voice in the co-creation of the thing that you want them to belong to is essential. And like I said, if you don't have belonging, it's kryptonite relative to innovation and transformation. So I don't talk about belonging because it's a warm and fuzzy HR thing and I want us to sing Kumbaya and all get along. I talk about belonging because I see it as a business imperative. I don't get how we compete in the future against everything we're up against if we don't have the diverse perspectives and if we're not harnessing them in the right way.
Wow. I need a moment here to just digest all that.
I'm sorry, and I speak in Irish rates. I should have warned you about that. There's a brogue and a pace that's atypical.
Yeah. So, you bring up a lot of valid points, and I'll just be honest in every way I can. I am the CEO of this organization, to use a business terminology, and as the commanding officer, everything you've said, I've absorbed, and I can only think back to just my time here, but not just that, but in my time in other organizations where I can recall moments or times where I questioned the sanity of those around me, and there's a great example where at the height of the IED kind of situation in Iraq, where the military knew that these V-shaped vehicles were going to save lives of Marines and soldiers that had to traverse hundreds and thousands of miles per month on the battlefield. And there's this large, higher headquarters fight to decide whether or not to invest that kind of money, or in our case, what we ended up doing was learning how to weld and plasma cut steel sheets to bolt it on and weld it onto our vehicles. And I remember doing this in Iraq and seeing everyone else doing it, and almost like this this weird it's like a scene from a movie, from a Coen Brothers movie, where we've all just like sheep have walked into and willingly are accepting that this is not going to work, but we're going to do it anyways because that's all we got, and no one cares at our level. None of the guys who are making those decisions are driving these thousands of miles. And I remember in 2006, we probably put, with no exaggeration, maybe 5,000 to 10,000 miles on the roads and on patrols and all over Western Iraq. And at great risk of our lives, just because we just didn't have these vehicles. They were there, just no one was going to make a decision. And it wasn't until there was like a political outcry, and I think we all remember the scene of the C-17s flying in, C-5s flying into Iraq, hand delivering these MRAPs into theater. I remember that vividly. Of course, I'm back in California, counting my fingers and toes, thankfully not having hit one. But this situation will occur time and time again. And in my own organization, I'd like to think, and I know in my heart of hearts it's not true, but I'd like to think that everyone at various levels can make a decision at maybe at the level above them that will impact them to help solve the problem. And post this conversation, I'll double down efforts to make sure that we have the right culture that encourages that.
Yeah.
Because,
and it is this age-old battle between alignment and autonomy, right? So you want to give people enough autonomy to speak up or to challenge or to escalate, while still having them fully aligned with the broader problem you're trying to solve. Right. So I would sort of encourage you to think about this, sort of the dials there and how you might adjust them, so that you still have full alignment with the mission and the priorities for the organization for the year, but you're giving people a little more autonomy on the front ends. The other way to do it is to think about being as data driven as possible. So you take as much subjectivity out of the equation, and as much seniority and rank. So the data kind of speaks for itself in some respects. And that's certainly one of the boards I'm on down in Brazil is what they call a neobank. It's a fully digital bank, started digital, everything about it is digital. And the way in which they do everything is so different to everything that I learned in the dino banks, as they call them, right? So for example, we have a process called KYC, where you have to know your customer. You have to verify somebody's identity before you can open an account. And they do it by having people take selfies and cross-referencing the selfies against social media and other things, right? Now, in our old world, that would be, where's your driver's license, your visa, like all of the paperwork stuff, and please come to the DMV and do this, right? So again, it's a little bit back to process innovation, but the point is, one of the ways in which they kind of keep that innovative edge is they just try and be as data-driven as possible in their decisioning, and everybody kind of knows that that's one of the MOs. And then the other thing they do is, which again, I think you guys have mastered, is sort of red team, blue team. At every single level of the organization, they purposefully set up their meetings as to say, okay, we're going to talk about this, and this is red team, blue, your red team, you guys now have to, your job is to actually push back on everything. And they find that way, it gives people permission as part of the process to completely disagree if they want to, or to find an alternative way to think about the problem. And it's just a way of sort of like furthering, like embedding in, let's get as much diverse perspectives. And they use, I think it's funny because it probably comes out of the military. This whole thing is like, if you're on a battlefield, it doesn't help that everybody on the team look at it through the same set of binoculars, right? They
Mhm.
want to have differing perspectives. So there's probably tricks, tactics maybe is the right word, that you can use to kind of just sort of continue to open the aperture here a little bit.
Wow. I'll go around the room, Susan. Any other comments, thoughts? All right, ma'am, I know we're limited on your time, but I want to give you a chance to just give some final comments or some closing comments. And again, on behalf of our team, I thank you for giving us this kind of insight. And one of the things I like about this is that it jerks kind of leadership, me in particular, on to refocus on the things that ultimately matter. And again, I can take that from anyone. And again, I appreciate your time. But over to you for final comments.
Oh, look, well, first of all, this was my honor. And Joe, thank you for making this happen. I would just, again, I would just encourage you, I always believed that if you couldn't go at a problem directly, there was always a way to go at it indirectly, right? So you might find that creating a culture of innovation is not that easily done in the military context or in your world. But perhaps then you say, okay, we're going to create a culture of curiosity, right? How might we encourage curiosity on the part of people? What might that look like? And more specifically, what are the ways in which we impede curiosity as an organization? So that's kind of like a sort of a backdoor way of getting into sort of similar space there. But the other thing I would just continue to encourage you to do is, as bizarre as some of the analogies might be, or how maybe, like I said, we come from different planets and speak different languages. I recall once taking the risk team that worked for me at one of the banks, and I was part of sort of another group of like other risk officers. So I was friends with the chief risk officer at Heineken, right, the beer company. And we decided it would be fun if we got our teams together for sort of an exchange of ideas, right? So we were bankers and they were beer makers. And I remember the guy opened the session with saying, we want to learn about you in financial services because you have to manage risk on a whole new level, right? And he said, our definition of risk here is we just want to get the beer in the glass and not get glass in the beer, right? That's how we think about risk, right? And I remember like that stuck in my head because I was like, wowzers, that's such a weird way to think about risk. But in his world, that was exactly what risk constituted, right? It was sort of health and safety and a lot of other things. So I would just continue to encourage you to open the aperture to other speakers from outside your universe where you can, because you will spark some little thought somewhere. It continues to sort of light this curiosity fire. You might get an odd nugget or two of value and wisdom. But I think it serves a purpose in and of itself of sort of giving people these other spheres where they can find the seams, right, in their own experiences. So I think it's wonderful that you do this, and I was really honored to be a part of the series.